New Mexico Territory, 1883. The wind was restless that evening, carrying with it the dry, acrid scent of sage and the memory of old violence. Beneath the amber sky, a lone figure walked along the ridge. His name was Cale, a Mescalero Apache, who had long ago turned his back on the wars and the settlements alike. Cale moved like the land itself, steady, quiet, impossible to read. The plains below him stretched into infinity, broken only by the skeletons of fence posts and the twisted remains of a cattle trail abandoned years before. He did not expect to see life here. This was a place things came to die. But then he heard it a sound thin as a thread nearly lost to the rising wind. A weak cry. His dark eyes narrowed. He lifted the hood of his faded coat to better hear. There it was again, a voice hoarse and breaking. Human. He followed the sound down the slope, boots crunching over brittle grass and stone. At the foot of a leaning fence post, he stopped. Bound to the wood with leather straps, a young woman slumped forward, her face hidden by a curtain of tangled hair. Her dress, once pale blue, was ripped and caked with red dust. She looked no older than 20. Cale approached, slowly assessing. Her hands were raw where she'd tried to fight free. Fresh bruises bloomed at her wrists and throat. She'd been left as a message or a punishment, both were common here. He crouched his long fingers, brushing her shoulder. Her skin was hot with fever. He drew the obsidian blade he carried, always a gift from his grandfather. With 2 quick motions, he sliced the straps. She pitched forward into his arms, so light it startled him. He adjusted his hold and lifted her, cradling her against his chest as her breath rasped weakly against his collarbone. "Easy," he murmured in Apache, though he did not expect she could hear or understand. The wind caught the hem of her dress, plastering it to her legs. The last light of day painted the horizon in bruised purple and dusty rose. She stirred, managing a strangled whisper. "Please." Cale did not answer. Instead, he wrapped his old hunting cloak around her trembling body, covering the torn fabric and the shame of what had been done to her. Then he turned away from the fence line and carried her into the deepening night. His shelter lay hidden in a cleft of red stone, a place only he and the coyotes knew. The climb was slow. He could feel her heart fluttering like a dying bird. At one point, she moaned in pain, trying to lift her head, but he pressed her gently back to his shoulder. "Save your strength," he said in English this time, his voice as soft as he could make it. By the time he reached the mouth of the hidden cave, darkness had swallowed the desert whole. He ducked inside, laying her carefully on a bed of pine boughs and rabbit fur. Then he lit the small fire pit in the center of the stone circle. The girl did not wake again, though her breath grew steadier in the warmth. Kyle removed her torn shoes and set them aside. He fetched a shallow bowl, filled it with clean water from his canteen, and set it near her lips. She was a stranger, white, likely from some ranch or distant town, but none of that mattered. She had been left to die, and he would not allow it. As the flames grew, the shadows receded. Kyle sat cross-legged by the fire, watching her face. Beneath the bruises, he could see she had once been beautiful. Perhaps she still was, but that too did not matter. What mattered was that she was breathing. Outside, the wind raked the canyon with 1,000 invisible claws. Inside, Kyle closed his eyes and whispered a single promise to the darkness. "No more harm," he said, his voice low and certain. "Not here." When dawn came, it painted the high desert in shades of gold and rust. The light crept slowly over Cale's hidden refuge, spilling across the stone floor and pooling around the sleeping woman's form. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering against the crusted lashes. For a moment, she didn't move at all, as if she were trying to decide whether it was safe to breathe. Then her gaze shifted, taking in the rough walls, the ashes of the night's fire, and finally the figure sitting a few feet away. Cale hadn't slept. He sat cross-legged near the hearth, shaping a new arrowhead with patient, deliberate strokes of flint on stone. When her eyes found him, he set the blade aside. "You're safe," he said quietly. His voice was deep and calm, as though he had been waiting hours for her to wake. She licked cracked lips and tried to sit. Pain seized her shoulders and she fell back onto the bedding with a gasp. He didn't move to help her up, only waited, watching her face. "Where?" Her voice rasped like dry grass. "Where am I?" Kyle studied her a moment before answering. "You're in a canyon north of the Rio Tesoro," he said. "A day's walk from the nearest settlement." She closed her eyes, her breath trembling. Did you bring me here?" "I did." "Why?" The question was raw, edged with confusion, and something darker, suspicion or fear. He understood it. A woman, left tied to a fence, had every reason to doubt any man's intentions. Kyle folded his hands in his lap. "Because you were dying," he said simply. She swallowed. He could see how the words landed, how she weighed them against whatever she remembered of the night before. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. You could have left me. I could have." Silence grew between them, punctuated by the small snapping sounds of embers in the fire pit. Outside, the morning wind pressed gently at the entrance, carrying the scent of cedar smoke and cold earth. At last, she shifted again, this time managing to raise herself onto one elbow. The motion cost her. Kyle saw the pain flash across her features, bruises flaring purple beneath her collarbone, the raw burn marks at her wrists. "What's your name?" she asked hoarsely. He hesitated. It had been years since anyone had asked him that question without malice or authority behind it. "Cale." She repeated it under her breath as if testing how it felt on her tongue. "Kyle." He nodded once. "And yours?" She looked down, studying the thin blanket he'd tucked around her. For a long moment he thought she might refuse to answer, but then she drew in a breath that seemed to steady her. "Josephine," she whispered. "Josie, mostly." "Josie," he echoed, careful not to let the name slip into familiarity too soon. Her gaze drifted to the leather cord he had tied around her wrist, binding a folded scrap of linen soaked with crushed sage and willow bark. She touched it, lightly, wincing. "You did this." "I did." It helped. He inclined his head, but said nothing. He had never been one to boast about small acts of kindness. Josie looked past him to where the morning sun angled through a gap in the rocks. Her eyes were wide hollow with exhaustion and memory. They left me there, tied up like an animal. Her voice cracked and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if she could shove the words back inside. Cale did not ask who they were. He had seen enough in his lifetime to know that the question could wait. Instead, he said, "You don't have to tell me, not yet." A shudder went through her. She nodded, tears shining in her lashes, though none fell. He reached to the side and lifted the shallow wooden bowl he'd prepared while she slept hot water, steeped with bitter herbs. He set it within her reach, but did not push it into her hands. "Drink," he said simply. "It will take the ache out of your bones." Josie eyed the bowl as if it might be another trap. But eventually she took it, fingers trembling. The first sip made her cough. Still, she drank. Cale watched her in silence, his thoughts careful and slow. This was not the first time he had pulled someone half dead from the desert, but it was the first time in many years he had felt something beyond obligation, a fragile stirring he could not yet name. When she finished, she looked up at him. Her voice was steadier, though still raw. "Thank you," she whispered. Kale inclined his head again, meeting her gaze without flinching. "You're welcome." For the first time since he had found her, she did not look away. The canyon held its hush all morning, a hush Josie had never known. Back in the towns she'd passed through, silence was a threat, something that fell over a room before violence erupted. But here, in this crease of rock and cedar, quiet felt like a living thing. Josie sat propped against the wall, her legs covered by Cale's extra blanket. Every time she shifted, pain rippled up her arms, but she bit it back. She would not show weakness in front of him, not more than she already had. Cale moved in and out of the shelter with the soft tread of someone who belonged to the land. He didn't ask her to help, didn't expect her to speak. When he returned from a trip to the stream, he carried a small bundle of roots and a fresh bandage. She eyed the supplies warily. "More medicine." He crouched beside her and nodded. "Your wrists are infected. The roots will help draw it out." Josie clenched her teeth, but didn't argue. She held her hands out, palms up, and forced herself to look away as he unwrapped the old poultice. The sight of raw, swollen flesh made her stomach twist. Cale worked in silence. His touch was steady, never rough. Once his thumb brushed against the inside of her wrist and something jolted up her arm that wasn't pain. She blinked, startled by the warmth of it, by how quickly she'd grown accustomed to his nearness. When he finished, he bound her wrists in fresh linen and sat back on his heels. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Does it hurt much?" he asked, his voice low. She swallowed. "Not as bad as yesterday." A faint line appeared between his brows as if he doubted her honesty. But he let it go. Outside, the wind shifted, stirring the hanging cedar branches that half concealed the cave's entrance. The smell of juniper drifted in cool and clean. Josie closed her eyes, breathing it in until the sharp edge of memory dulled. When she looked again, Cale was watching her. Not with pity, she realized, but something closer to curiosity. "Why were you alone out there?" he asked finally. Josie's mouth opened, then closed. Words crowded her throat, pressing against her teeth. But she couldn't make herself give them shape. If she said them aloud, they would become real again, heavier than she could bear. Cale didn't push her. He turned, reaching for the small pot he had set near the coals. "Soup," he said. "You need to eat." She almost laughed at the simplicity of it, as if food could mend the split places inside her. But when he ladled the broth into a wooden cup and passed it across the space between them, her fingers closed around it. The first sip was warm and savory, chasing the ache from her belly. She drank without stopping, grateful for something tangible, something that wasn't fear or shame. When the cup was empty, she set it aside and leaned her head back against the wall. "Kyle," she said quietly, "is this your home?" He was tending the fire, but he paused. "It is," he said after a moment, "or as close as I've ever had to one." "You live here alone?" "Yes." Her gaze drifted to the stacked supplies, bundles of dried meat, a neat pile of furs, a string of herbs hanging from the ceiling. Everything had its place arranged with a care that made her throat ache. "You saved me," she whispered, "and you don't even know who I am." Cale met her eyes across the glow of the fire. "I know enough." The quiet stretched between them, but it was no longer heavy. She didn't know what to call this hush, this space he made around her. It wasn't safety, not entirely. She still felt raw and skittish, like a rabbit that hadn't yet decided whether to bolt. But it was possible, like the first slow breath after choking. Josie wrapped her arms tighter around herself. She was afraid if she moved, she'd shatter. "Rest," Cale said. "You're safe here." Her eyes stung. She looked away, blinking fast. But when she lay down on the furs and pulled the blanket over her shoulders, she didn't protest. And when she closed her eyes for the first time in weeks, the darkness behind them didn't reach for her. Dawn came soft and blue, seeping into the cave without fanfare. Josie woke to find Cale already gone, the place eerily still. For a moment her heart thumped in panic. Had he decided she wasn't worth the trouble? Then she heard the faint sound of something being chopped beyond the curtain of cedar. Relief left her weak. She sat up carefully, testing her wrists. They throbbed, but the swelling had eased. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and waited. She didn't know why, but stepping outside felt like crossing some invisible line. In here, she could almost pretend she was someone else. Someone unhurt. Footsteps crunched over gravel. Cale's silhouette appeared tall and lean, carrying a bundle of dry wood under one arm. He paused when he saw her awake. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning." Her voice came out hoarse. He set the wood down by the fire pit and began arranging it with careful hands. She watched him work, studying the lines of his face in the early light. He was younger than she'd first thought, no more than 30, maybe less, but his eyes looked older, worn by years no one had recorded. "You don't have to keep me here," she blurted. Kyle didn't look up. "I know. You've done enough. More than enough. You saved me, gave me food and a place to sleep, but you don't owe me anything." His hands stilled on the kindling. He lifted his gaze steady as always. "I don't help people because I owe them." The simple finality in his tone silenced her. She swallowed, voice trembling. Then, why? Cale placed a flint against steel. A spark leapt into the dry moss, flickered, then caught. Only when the small flame steadied did he answer. Because once he said quietly, "Someone found me half dead in the snow, fed me, gave me a name, and never asked me to earn it." Josie hugged her knees to her chest. "What was your name before?" He smiled faintly. "Doesn't matter now. The name she gave me was Cale. It means one who stays." Josie closed her eyes. She wondered what it would feel like to be named something kind. Something that didn't belong to a man with fists or a deed of ownership. When she looked up, he was watching her in that patient way she was starting to expect. "You don't have to tell me yours," he said, "if you want to leave it behind." Her breath caught. No one had ever offered her that. She swallowed, trying to find the courage. "My real name is Josephine, but nobody's called me that in a long time." Cale nodded once as if she'd given him something precious. Josephine. The way he spoke it carefully without pity made her throat ache. She stared into the flames, voice small. "Does it ever stop feeling like you're waiting for someone to come drag you back?" He was silent for a long moment. Then he rose, walked to the entrance, and pushed the cedar curtain aside. Pale light spilled in. "Come," he said. She hesitated, then stood. Her legs wobbled, but she didn't fall. Outside, the wind moved in the pines high and restless, but the air down here felt steady. Kyle led her along a narrow path that twisted up the slope behind the cave. The climb was slow. She stopped often to catch her breath, but he never rushed her. When they reached the ridge, she saw why he'd brought her. From here, the valley spread out in all directions, rolling hills and distant mesas painted gold by the new sun. A river threaded through it all, shining like a piece of glass. "This is where I came when I was afraid," he said, "to remember how big the world is." Josephine's eyes stung. She didn't know if it was the cold wind or something else. Kyle turned to her. "You can leave your old name behind if you want, but you can also keep it. It's yours, not theirs." She pressed a hand to her throat where the old bruises were almost gone. "I don't know who I am yet," she whispered. "That's all right," Cale said. "You have time." They stood in silence as the wind rushed around them. And for the first time, Josephine realized she wasn't waiting for footsteps behind her. Here she was, simply alive. Days fell into a rhythm Josie hadn't known she needed. Mornings began before the sun crested the hills with Cale tending the traps he set near the creek and her learning to light the fire without choking it with smoke. She moved slowly, cautious of every ache, but each dawn brought a little more strength to her limbs. They spoke rarely at first. Kyle seemed to understand that questions could feel like cages. He showed her things instead, how to tell which roots eased fever, which bark turned to salve when crushed, how to listen for the low, soft calls of quail in the brush. One afternoon, she found him outside the cave smoothing the shaft of an arrow with a scrap of sandstone. She watched for a while before gathering her courage. "Will you teach me?" she asked. He lifted his head, brows raised. To make one, she clarified, nodding at the arrow. And to use it. Cale studied her face. "You sure? I need to know how." She swallowed. "In case someone comes again." He didn't question it further. Just set the half-shaped arrow aside and picked up a straight length of aspen he'd left drying. He showed her how to measure the spine by flexing it gently, how to shave away the rough spots without splitting the grain. Her hands were clumsy, but he never scolded. When she grew frustrated and nearly snapped the shaft in two, he only set his palm lightly over hers and said, "Try slower." They worked until the light turned amber. By dusk, she had something that looked more like an arrow than a stick. Her shoulders ached, but for the first time in years she felt the small, steady thrill of having created something that was hers alone. That evening, Cale built a small fire and laid a single fish across the stones to roast. The smoke curled upward, carrying the clean scent of cedar. Josie sat cross-legged, staring into the flames. "Did you ever think you'd come back here?" she asked. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "No," he said. "I thought I'd leave this land behind, start over somewhere no one knew me. Why didn't you—" His mouth curved just a little. Turns out, nowhere felt like home. She knew that truth too well. Silence stretched between them, comfortable now like a quilt that kept the dark out. Later, when she lay down, she found she couldn't sleep. The cave felt too small, the fire too bright. Without quite deciding to, she rose and stepped outside. The night was sharp with autumn chill, but she didn't mind. She walked a little way down the path until she reached a boulder that overlooked the creek. There she sat, knees pulled to her chest, and closed her eyes. The water whispered over stones below. Somewhere, far off, a coyote sang to the moon. And for the first time since she'd been tied to that fence, she let herself remember not just the bruises, but the girl she'd been before. Before debts, before locked doors, before forgetting she was more than someone else's property. She opened her mouth and began to sing, voice so soft it barely disturbed the air. It wasn't a hymn or a tune she'd learned in the brothel. Just a simple melody her mother had hummed while shelling peas on the back porch. The sound was thin trembling, but it was hers. Cale didn't interrupt. She sensed him behind her, quiet and patient, but he didn't step closer. When her song trailed off, she looked over her shoulder. He nodded once, as though she'd done something braver than any defense. "I thought I'd forgotten it," she murmured. "You didn't." Her throat tightened. "I don't want to forget anything anymore, not even the bad parts." Cale's voice was low. "That's how you know you survived." Josie pressed her palm over her chest, where her heartbeat felt stronger than it had in years. The night was cold, but she didn't shiver. In this place, she finally understood that memory wasn't always a prison. Sometimes it was proof she'd been real all along. When she went back inside, she left the door flap open to the stars. The next morning dawned silver and cold. Josie woke to the hush that always came before Cale returned from checking his snares. She pulled on the tunic he'd given her, soft with wear, smelling faintly of cedar, and stepped out to see the sky pale with early light. A few feet from the cave, Kyle was kneeling, studying something in the dirt. She hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but he lifted his head and beckoned her forward. "Look," he said simply. She crouched beside him, pressing her palm to the cold earth for balance. At first, she saw nothing but churned dust and flattened weeds. Then she saw a clear, fresh boot print. The sole was cross-hatched with a pattern she recognized militia issue. Her chest tightened. "Riders?" she asked, voice thin. "2, maybe 3. His finger traced another print, half obscured. They passed through sometime after midnight. Her mouth was dry. "Looking for me." Cale didn't answer, which was answer enough. He straightened and scanned the trees. His gaze was as unreadable as always, but the way his jaw set told her he was already thinking 10 steps ahead. She swallowed. "If they find this place—" "They won't," he said, quiet but certain. He began gathering what few supplies they kept outside, bundles of dried herbs, the spare tools, the tanned hides curing on a rack. She watched for a heartbeat, then moved to help. Fear tried to creep in, but she forced her hands steady. She had run all her life. Maybe she would have to again. But this time she wouldn't do it as the girl she'd been. This time she had a name. By mid-morning, they'd hidden all trace of their camp under brush and loose stones. Kyle showed her how to scatter ash in the fire pit so it looked cold for days, how to rake fresh tracks over their own. Each step was methodical, practiced like he'd done it 100 times before. "Who taught you this?" she asked. He hesitated. "My mother. She taught you to disappear. She taught me to survive." Josie pressed her lips together, feeling something that wasn't quite sorrow and not quite gratitude. She thought of her own mother, a woman who'd taught her how to mend shirts and knead bread, but never how to vanish. When they finished, Cale led her higher up the ridge where a shallow cave opened behind a stand of juniper. It was smaller than the first shelter, but dry and hidden by a spill of rock. She ducked inside, hugging her arms around herself. "Will we wait here?" she asked. "For now." He set down his bow and a wrapped bundle of smoked meat, then crouched to look her in the eye. "I'll keep watch." Her throat tightened. "And if they come, then we decide what to do together." Something about the word "together" made the panic in her chest ease just a fraction. She nodded, pressing her hand to the leather cord at her throat, the one that had once been a shackle, now just a strip of memory. The hours passed slow as resin. She dozed in short, fitful bursts, waking each time the wind shifted. Outside, Kyle moved like a shadow between the rocks, always returning to the mouth of the cave to listen. Sometimes he glanced in at her, and each time she felt a little steadier. Near dusk, she gathered the courage to crawl out beside him. The sun was setting behind the far hills, smearing the sky in blood-colored streaks. Cale's voice was low. They were bounty riders. Her stomach clenched. "You saw them." He nodded. "I watched them circle the valley. They didn't find our trail. But they'll be back. Then we can't stay here." "No." She looked at the horizon, heart hammering. All her life, every new place had turned into a trap eventually. But she was so tired of running, so tired of losing every piece of herself she managed to rebuild. Kyle was watching her, the last of the light catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. She thought of the first night he'd carried her to safety, of the way he'd never asked her to explain or apologize, the way he'd said her name like it was something she could grow into. "Where will we go?" she whispered. His answer was steady. "Where they won't think to look. Into the canyons, past the old silver mines." Her pulse fluttered. "You know the way." I know every path in these hills." She let out a shivering breath. Then she reached for his hand, resting her scarred fingers against his palm. He didn't pull away. The quiet between them was not fear, not anymore. It was something closer to resolve. That night, as the darkness deepened around them, Josie felt something she hadn't known in years, the quiet, defiant certainty that she would not be caught again, that she was no longer a thing to be claimed. She was a woman with her own name, and she was not alone. At dawn, the canyon looked like another world. Ridges of red stone rose on every side, layered with centuries of wind-carved scars. Juniper and sage clung to the ledges in ragged tufts. High above, a hawk traced slow circles in the warming air. Josie followed Cale along a narrow path that wove between sheer cliffs. Her legs were sore from the climb, but she didn't complain. She could feel the urgency in his movements, the way he scanned every shadow, every hollow. They reached a shelf of flat stone overlooking the valley they had left behind. Far in the distance, the tiny thread of smoke showed where riders were camped. She shivered, pulling Kyle's old deerskin cloak tighter around her shoulders. "They'll keep searching?" she asked. He nodded. "For a while. They're paid by the head." The words made her feel suddenly cold, like a hunted animal, like she always had before. But she took a slow breath and made herself look at the smoke, refusing to turn away. "I'm tired of running," she whispered. Kyle was quiet beside her. She didn't expect an argument. He was not a man who wasted words trying to make the world kinder than it was. He only studied her face as if measuring whether she truly meant it. "They'll come here eventually," he said at last. "Then we make it harder for them," she replied. She surprised herself with how steady her voice was. His eyes softened just a little. "It will not be safe. It never has been." She reached up and touched the smooth riverstone necklace he'd given her, a name she had claimed for herself, a promise she'd whispered to the wind. He turned to face her fully. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The hawk cried overhead. The air tasted of dust and sun and something that felt like belonging. Kyle spoke quietly. "When I found you at the fence, you were already stronger than you knew." Her throat tightened. "You think I'm strong now?" "I think he said you're ready to stop hiding." A tear slipped free, cutting a clean line through the grit on her cheek. She didn't try to wipe it away. "We'll build something here," she said, her voice catching. "Something they can't burn down." His gaze didn't waver. "Then we stay." She exhaled, feeling the ache in her chest loosen. For so long, every place she'd ever sheltered had been a borrowed corner, a temporary refuge before the next flight. This time, she was choosing to stand her ground. Slowly, she stretched out her hand. Cale took it without hesitation. His palm was warm and rough, steady as the stone at her back. When she spoke again, her voice was almost a vow. "They will come," she said. "And we will be ready," he replied. Below them, the smoke rose like a thin threat on the horizon. But, for the first time, Josie felt no urge to look for a path away, only the certainty that she had already traveled far enough to know her own worth. She was not prey anymore. She was Yara now, and she had chosen her ground. The day they built the fire was the day the wind changed. It blew strong and clear from the west, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of something new. Cale had been gathering cedar branches since dawn, stacking them in a wide ring around the small clearing tucked against the canyon wall. Yara helped without speaking much, though her hands moved with purpose. For hours, they worked in a rhythm that felt almost like prayer, collecting, arranging, preparing. When the sun climbed to its highest point, Kyle knelt in the center of the ring. He set flint to tinder, coaxing the first small flame to life. Smoke curled upward, blue and fragrant. Yara watched him, her heart loud in her chest. She remembered the day he had first laid her by a fire, half dead and nameless. She had woken afraid to believe that anything could be different. But here she was alive enough to hope. Kyle looked up and met her gaze. "Come here." She stepped forward. He took her hand and guided it to the kindling. Together they fed the flame. Dry branches caught crackling as heat bloomed between them. "It's yours to name," he said, his voice low. "Yours to claim." Yara swallowed. Her mouth felt dry. For a moment, the smoke blurred her vision, or maybe it was the weight of everything she was finally letting go. "I don't want the old name," she whispered, "or the old story." He nodded once. "Then speak the one you choose." She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw the fence post where she'd been left to die. She saw the faces of the men who had called her by a name that was never hers. She saw the girl she'd been starved, beaten, silent, and she let her go. When she opened her eyes, the fire had grown. It glowed steady hot enough to burn through the last threads of her fear. "My name is Yara," she said, voice rising over the wind. "I am not owned. I am not lost. I am not broken." The words hung in the air like an invocation. Cale reached into the pouch at his belt. He drew out a small object, a carved disc of pale bone, worn smooth by years of touch. He placed it in her palm. "This belonged to my mother," he told her. "She gave it to me when I was old enough to understand the meaning of keeping something safe." Yara turned the disc over in her fingers. It was etched with a spiral, a simple line winding inward to a single point. "What does it mean?" she asked softly. "That you carry your own center," he said. "That you decide what stays and what goes." Her throat ached. She closed her fist around the disc, feeling its weight. For the first time in her life, she understood what it was to own something that could not be taken away. They stood together in silence as the fire burned lower. The smoke rose into the sky, carrying with it all the names and shadows she no longer needed. When the last embers faded to ash, Yara turned to Kyle. The wind pulled at her hair, lifting it from her shoulders like a banner. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved yourself." Maybe that was true. But as she looked out across the canyon, she knew she hadn't done it alone. They would stay here in the place they'd claimed together. When the rains came, they would build a roof strong enough to hold. When the cold came, they would stack wood high and keep the fire alive. There would be more hunters, more threats. She felt no illusion about that. But she no longer felt powerless. She was Yara now, and no matter what came, she would never be nameless again. High overhead, the hawk circled once more. The wind carried the last curls of smoke into the bright sky, and in the quiet that followed, Yara felt it, not an ending, a beginning.